To my son, Randall James Engel. I leave the entirety of my real property at 4712 Lakeshore Drive, including all structures, furnishings, and the new electric sport utility vehicle registered in my name, the heavy oak desk pressed hard against my knees. Above us, a ceiling fan turned with a slow, rhythmic click that seemed to echo in the small room. The air smelled like dry paper, old dust, and the bitter remains of morning coffee, sitting too long in the pot. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my thumb pressing hard against the side of my index finger until the skin turned white. Additionally, Malcolm Pruitt continued, his voice perfectly flat, stripping every ounce of emotion from the words. All investment accounts held at the primary brokerage, account numbers ending 7741 and 8823, totaling approximately $15 million. Beside me, my father exhaled. It was not a sigh of grief for a man buried 3 days ago. It was a long, deep release of breath, the kind a person makes when they drop a crushing weight onto the floor. Next to him, Bonnie crossed her legs. Her manicured fingernails began to tap against the side of her leather purse. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Keeping perfect time with the money. I am 38 years old. I work for the County Department of Health and Human Services as a child welfare advocate. I spend 40 hours a week stepping into broken homes, sitting on sagging couches, and telling terrified people that their worst nightmare is happening right now. I know how to manage a crisis. I know how to read a room, de-escalate panic, and keep my face completely blank when someone screams at me. But sitting in that dark law office, listening to a stranger divide up my grandfather's life, my professional training completely vanished. Pruitt turned a thick, cream-colored page. The paper made a sharp scraping sound in the quiet room. To my granddaughter, Darcy May Engel, I leave the following personal effects. Pruitt stopped reading and looked up over the rims of his wire glasses. His eyes met mine for the first time since we walked through his door. 1 Waltham pocket watch, serial number 1847, 1 leather-bound journal, and a collection of personal correspondence stored in a cedar box, located in the study closet. Randall shifted his weight in the leather chair. He adjusted the wide silver watch on his left wrist, a piece of jewelry he traded in for a newer model every 2 years. Bonnie smiled, not a polite, sympathetic curve of the lips, but a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. It was the first time I had seen her look truly happy since the funeral began. The floor beneath my chair felt suddenly uneven. I had always known I was the granddaughter, not the child. I expected the house to go to my father. But the coordinated silence between them, the absolute lack of surprise, told me everything I needed to know. They had discussed this outcome long before they walked into this building. Pruitt closed the folder, the heavy cover slapped against the desk. He placed both hands flat over the document. Would you like me to continue reading the next page, Randall? My father was already standing. He smoothed the front of his grey sport coat and reached across the desk to shake the lawyer's hand. We are good here, Malcolm. The terms are crystal clear. Thank you for your time. Pruitt did not let go of the folder. He looked directly at my father. I strongly advise you to listen to the rest of the document, Randall. The lawyer spoke with the same flat, measured tone, but his knuckles were white where he pressed against the paper. I have a property showing across town in 30 minutes, my father said, already turning toward the door. Darcy, are you riding back to the house with us, or do you need a minute? I looked at Pruitt. He stared back at me without blinking. He gave no nod, no signal, nothing but a steady, heavy gaze that made the hair on my arms stand up. I stood up, gathered my coat, and followed my father out into the hallway. The drive back to the Lakeshore house took 20 minutes. Bonnie did not even wait until we cleared the parking lot before pulling out her phone. She sat in the passenger seat, twisting her body toward the window, keeping her voice pitched in a sweet, breathless whisper. 3.2 million for the East Wing alone, she murmured into the receiver. Yes. The listing agreement will be ready by Thursday morning. I sat in the back seat and watched her eyes flick up to the rearview mirror. She caught my reflection watching her, her smile stretched wide and tight across her face. She pulled the phone away from her mouth for half a second. Just a friend, sweetie, she mouthed, before turning back to the glass. When we reached the house, I walked straight past the kitchen and headed up the stairs. My bedroom sat right next to my grandfather's suite. The door to his room stood wide open. The mattress on his bed still held the slight, shallow indentation near the edge, where he used to sit every morning to put on his shoes. I walked into my room, shut the door, and set the small cedar box on my desk. Inside lay the Waltham pocket watch. The glass face carried a dozen tiny scratches from years of sitting on a wooden workbench, but the second hand kept sweeping in a smooth, relentless circle. He wound it every single morning without fail. I picked it up, feeling the solid brass weight resting cold and heavy against my palm. I turned it over, staring at the smooth metal back, looking for something that was not there. Beneath the watch sat a brown leather journal. A thick elastic band held the soft cover shut. The worn material smelled exactly like him, a mixture of old paper dust and a faint, sharp trace of machine oil from the garage. I slipped the band off and opened the front cover. His handwriting filled the center of the first page. Tall, precise block letters, standing straight up and down, the kind only a mechanical engineer uses. Darcy. Open when needed. I flipped past the first page. Rows of numbers, scattered dates, and short notations covered the paper. Columns that did not add up to anything I recognized. Downstairs, Bonnie's voice echoed up through the floorboards. She was laughing loudly, telling someone on the phone about ripping out the oak floors to put in grey vinyl planking. I closed the journal and stretched the elastic band back over the cover. I was too exhausted to decode a puzzle. My chest felt hollowed out, scraped clean by the reality that 12 years of making his meals, pushing his chair up the driveway, and listening to his war stories had amounted to a box of old paper. I left the journal sitting on the nightstand. That night, I lay on my back, staring at the dark ceiling. The quiet of the house felt entirely wrong. For 3 years, I had kept one ear tuned to the hallway, waiting for the sound of his metal walker scraping against the wood or the low cough that meant he needed a glass of water. Now there was only the distant hum of the refrigerator, floating somewhere between waking and sleeping. My mind drifted back 2 years, landing on a cold Tuesday morning in the kitchen. I had been wiping down the counters after breakfast. A bank statement sat right in the middle of the dining table. My grandfather never left loose paper lying around. Every bill, every medical record, every letter went straight into a labeled folder inside his office desk. But this document sat wide open, pressed flat against the wood. 3 distinct lines near the bottom glowed with bright yellow highlighter. The numbers caught my eye before I could look away. 5 digits, large, sweeping withdrawals. Before I could turn around, he walked into the kitchen. I froze, expecting him to scold me for looking at his private mail. He walked slowly to the counter, poured himself a fresh cup of black coffee, and walked over to the table. He sat down heavily in his chair. He looked at me, and then he looked down at the highlighted paper. "Do not worry about that, Das," he said. His voice sounded completely calm, stripped of any anger or surprise, just some family business. But he did not pick the paper up. He did not fold it away. He let it sit there between us for another full minute, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. He kept his eyes on me. He wanted me to see the paper. He wanted me to remember those bright yellow lines. I rolled over in bed and pressed my face deep into the pillow. The memory made absolutely no sense. During his last lucid afternoon, he held my hand and told me he had everything handled. He taught me how to fix a leaky faucet when I was 10 years old, telling me never to throw things away just because they were temporarily broken. but he had left me with nothing. He had given the house to the son who never visited. And tomorrow, I was going to have to wake up and face the people who had taken the rest. I woke up at 6:45 the next morning to a sound that did not belong in my grandfather's house. A heavy, rhythmic scraping noise dragged across the polished oak floorboards in the hallway. I pushed my blankets aside, feeling the cold wood against my bare feet, and opened my bedroom door. Bonnie stood in the corridor. She was pressing a long strip of clear packing tape across the top of a large cardboard moving box. 2 other sealed boxes sat stacked neatly against the floral wallpaper. Through the open doorway of my room, I could see my closet doors pushed wide open, my clothes, my books, my emergency snack bag from a work conference 3 years ago. Everything I owned had been stripped from the shelves. The entirety of my life in this house had been packed away into 3 cardboard squares. "Bonnie," I said, my voice thick and dry from sleep. "What are you doing?" She did not look up from her work. Her hands smoothed the tape over the cardboard seam with practiced efficiency. "We need this room, honey. Randall is turning it into a home gym." Her voice sounded incredibly sweet. She spoke with the casual, bright tone of someone discussing a pleasant dinner menu. Completely disconnected from the fact that she was dismantling a 12-year arrangement before the sun fully came up, I stepped out into the hallway. Randall stood near the top of the stairs. He leaned his back against the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He wore his expensive grey sport coat, perfectly pressed, over a crisp white shirt. He did not step forward to help his wife lift the heavy boxes, and he did not raise a hand to stop her. He just stood there, watching the floorboards, holding the exact posture he had perfected over his entire life. It was the posture of a man who was physically present, but completely isolated from the consequences of his own choices. "Dad," I said, looking straight at him. "What is going on?" Randall shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He kept his eyes fixed on the baseboards near my toes. "Bonnie is right, kiddo. It is time. You have your apartment in town, and you have your county job. This house needs adjustments. We are making changes today." Adjustments. Changes. Those were sterile words pulled directly from a real estate brochure. They were not words you used with your own family. I looked down at the top box, sitting at my feet. My bottle of daily moisturizer lay sideways, pressed hard against the cardboard edge. Right next to it sat a framed photograph of my grandfather and me from last Christmas. The picture had been placed face down. The blank brown backing of the frame stared blindly up at the ceiling. Bonnie stood up and brushed her hands down the front of her expensive silk trousers. She tilted her head to the side and offered me that same tight, perfect smile she had worn in the law office yesterday. "Now you are homeless, sweetie," she said softly. "Well, not really homeless. You have options, you are young, and you will figure it out. We just need you clear of the property by noon." She turned on her heel and walked lightly down the stairs. A minute later, the sharp, mechanical hiss of a brand new espresso machine echoed up from the kitchen. They had bought it the afternoon of the funeral. I stood in the hallway, staring at the man who gave me half my DNA. He finally looked up and met my eyes. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscle twitched just beneath his skin. He knew this was wrong. The heavy tension rolling off his shoulders filled the entire space between us. But he had made his choice. He had chosen the money, the house, and the woman downstairs. When my father made a choice, he never looked back to see what he had crushed in the process. The instinct to make myself small washed over me instantly. It was a reflex I had learned a long time ago. Do not argue, do not cause a scene, and do not give them a single reason to call you the difficult one. I bent down, picked up the first heavy box, and carried it down the stairs. I walked right past the kitchen, where the rich smell of dark roasted coffee filled the warm air, and carried my life out to the freezing driveway. I loaded the first 2 boxes into the trunk of my car. The morning wind carried a sharp bite of frost. When I brought the final box out, I set it carefully on the bumper, and my fingers brushed against the back of the face-down photograph. I stopped, pulled the frame from the box, and turned it over. My grandfather was smiling in the picture. It was a real smile, the kind that crinkled the deep lines around his eyes, and his heavy, warm hand rested firmly on my shoulder. A cold jolt hit the bottom of my stomach. The pocket watch was still in my coat, but the leather journal was missing. I had forgotten the book on the nightstand upstairs. I left the trunk open and walked quickly back into the house. Bonnie was standing at the kitchen island, sipping her coffee, tapping her manicured nails against the marble counter. I walked past her without making a sound, took the stairs 2 at a time, and went straight into my empty room. The brown leather journal sat exactly where I left it. I picked it up, feeling the worn texture under my thumbs, and remembered the crisp handwriting on the very first page. I clutched the book to my chest, walked back down the stairs, and left the house for the final time. I parked my car at the far end of Lakeshore Drive, pulled over against the curb, and turned the engine off. Through the rearview mirror, I could see the front gate of the estate. Bonnie was already standing by the brick pillar, replacing the brass nameplate on the mailbox with a new custom plate. I looked down at my lap and pulled the elastic band off the journal. I opened the front cover. The handwriting was perfectly straight, heavily pressed into the thick paper. The phone number for Malcolm Pruitt is 269-555-0147. Call him. He knows everything. And Darcy, make sure you read page 2. They did not read page 2. I sat in the cold car for 20 solid minutes. I stared at the 10-digit phone number written in blue ink. My thumb hovered over my phone screen, but I could not bring myself to dial. Half of me desperately wanted to make the call and find out what secret my grandfather had left behind. The other half was paralyzed by a very specific, hollow fear. I was terrified that page 2 was just another meaningless legal technicality. I was terrified that he had actually forgotten me, that he had handed his entire legacy over to the man who ignored him for a decade, and that the journal was just an empty gesture from a dying man. I put the car in gear and drove toward the city center. My apartment was a tiny studio on Main Street, a 550-square-foot box I rented out of necessity. It was a place I only used to store my work clothes because I had spent every free weekend and evening at the mansion. I unlocked the deadbolt and pushed the door open. The air inside felt stale and trapped. I carried the 3 cardboard boxes inside and set them on the peeling vinyl floor. The space was completely bare. A cracked ceramic plate sat abandoned in the kitchen sink. The cheap refrigerator hummed with a loud, vibrating buzz that set my teeth on edge. I looked around the tiny room, realizing this was my entire existence without my grandfather. 550 square feet, costing me $850 a month in rent. A hollow life. He had taught me not to throw things away just because they were broken. But standing in that empty room, it felt like he had thrown me away the second he died. I sat down on the floor next to the boxes. The vinyl was freezing against my legs. I pulled my knees to my chest, breathing in the smell of old dust and enclosed spaces. And then, slowly, the cold panic began to recede. And something else took its place. My professional training kicked in. I had sat in dozens of living rooms just like this one, holding county clipboards, talking to terrified mothers who had just been handed eviction notices by abusive family members. I knew exactly how the system worked. I knew the protocol. You document everything. You secure your housing. You find legal representation. And you absolutely never sign anything when you are in a state of emotional shock. I had spent my entire adult life teaching vulnerable people how to survive this exact scenario. I just never thought I would be the client sitting on the floor. The training did not erase the grief, but it gave me a ladder to climb out of the panic. I was not helpless. I was a social worker, and I knew how to fight. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed the number from the journal. The line rang exactly twice before the lawyer picked up. "Darcy," Malcolm Pruitt said. His voice sounded remarkably sharp. completely lacking the flat, professional drone he had used during the reading yesterday. I wondered when you would call. What is on page 2? I asked, my voice echoing slightly against the bare walls of the apartment. Come to my office right now, he replied. We are not having this conversation over the telephone. And, Darcy, make sure you bring the journal. 2 hours after I hung up the phone, I sat in the exact same heavy leather chair I had occupied the day before. The wall clock ticked steady and loud against the dry air the old air conditioner pushed through the room. Malcolm Pruitt did not sit down immediately. He walked over to his heavy oak door and turned the brass lock. The sharp click echoed in the quiet space. He closed the window blinds, twisting the plastic rod until the bright morning sun was completely blocked out, leaving us in the warm yellow glow of his desk lamp. He walked back to his wide desk and sat down. He placed a thick manila folder directly in front of me. It was noticeably heavier than the thin document he had read from yesterday. The front cover bore no title, just my grandfather's neat block handwriting across the top right corner. Yesterday morning, Pruitt said, his voice dropping an octave, settling into a low, measured rhythm, I read the first page of the will for your family. I advised your father to stay and listen to the rest. He told me that was not necessary. The lawyer leaned forward and folded his hands over the thick paper file. He really should have listened. Pruitt opened the folder. He did not read from it right away. Instead, he began to explain the contents with the slow, deliberate patience of a teacher making sure a student understood every single word. Everything your grandfather owned, the entire $15 million estate, the investment portfolios, and the house on Lakeshore Drive, does not belong to Randall. It belongs to the Vernon James Engel Irrevocable Trust. We established this specific legal structure 2 years ago under the Michigan Trust Code. I stared at the thick stack of paper. My heart began to beat a little faster. A quiet thumping against my ribs. Irrevocable? It means the terms cannot be altered, cancelled, or easily contested by anyone, Pruitt explained. He tapped his index finger against the top page, and this document contains a very specific restriction called a spendthrift provision. Randall is a beneficiary of the trust, but he does not own the principal assets. He cannot sell the mansion. He cannot take out a mortgage on the property. He cannot liquidate the stock portfolios. The trust simply pays him an allowance of $4,000 a month for his living expenses. The room felt suddenly completely still. I thought about the 3 cardboard boxes sitting on the peeling vinyl floor of my tiny apartment. I thought about Bonnie ordering custom license plates and picking out grey flooring for a house she did not actually own. If Randall does not own the house, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, then who manages the trust? Pruitt pushed the open folder across the polished wood until it rested inches from my hands. You do, Darcy. You are the sole trustee. I looked down at the documents. My name was printed across the top of the second page in bold black letters. The legal text blurred in front of my eyes. For 12 years, I had made myself as small and invisible as possible around my father, accepting whatever scraps of attention he threw my way, swallowing his casual dismissals because he was the parent and I was the child. Now, sitting in this quiet room, I realized my grandfather had quietly reached out from the grave and handed me the keys to my father's entire existence. There is more, Pruitt said softly. Your grandfather added a specific moral forfeiture clause, under state law. The person funding the trust has broad discretion over the terms. Vernon dictated that if the beneficiary demonstrates conduct reflecting extreme financial irresponsibility or familial cruelty within 90 days of his death, the trustee has the absolute right to reduce or terminate that monthly allowance. My hands felt cold. I gripped the armrests of the heavy chair. He knew Randall was going to throw me out of the house. He knew it before he even died. Pruitt finally showed a crack in his professional armor. A small, sad smile touched the corners of his mouth, and he gave a slow nod. Vernon knew his son. He sat right where you are sitting, and he told me that if Randall bothered to read the second page, he would behave himself. But if Randall refused to read the second page, it meant he had not changed. And the trap would spring. The lawyer stood up, walked over to a small filing cabinet, and pulled out a secondary, thinner file. He brought it back to the desk. We did not build this structure out of thin air, Darcy. 18 months ago, Vernon discovered that $320,000 had been withdrawn from his primary brokerage accounts. The money was taken using the durable financial power of attorney he had granted your father years earlier. The withdrawals were funneled through a phantom company called Engel Properties Capital. The cold feeling in my hands spread up my arms. $320,000. The memory of that Tuesday morning in the kitchen hit me with the force of a physical blow. The bank statement, the yellow highlighter. He had known. He had intentionally left it on the table for me to see. 8 months before he died, Pruitt continued. Vernon confronted him. He called Randall on the telephone and asked about the missing funds. Randall lied. He claimed it was just routine portfolio management, but Vernon recorded that entire phone conversation. Michigan is a one-party consent state for audio recordings, which means that file is perfectly legal evidence. Bonnie, I said, the pieces suddenly snapping together in my mind. That is why she was so happy yesterday. She thinks they got away with it. Bonnie attended the initial meeting when we updated this trust, Pruitt noted dryly. She sat in my conference room for exactly 10 minutes, checked her phone twice, complained that the coffee was cold, and then stood up and announced she had a real estate showing across town. I kept the sign-in sheet with her signature and the timestamp, and just to ensure no one could challenge his mental capacity. Your grandfather sat in this office 6 months ago and recorded a full video deposition with me. He was completely sharp, fully aware, and he explained exactly why he was doing this. I looked at the older man across the desk. The sheer scale of what my grandfather had engineered felt overwhelming. It was not just a will. It was a machine. Every single gear had been cut and polished and set into place, waiting for my father to turn the crank. Why did he not just cut him out completely? I asked. If he knew Randall stole the money, if he knew Randall would kick me out, why leave him anything at all? Pruitt was silent for a long time. He looked down at his folded hands, and when he finally spoke, he used my grandfather's first name. Vernon told me, "He is my son. I will not cut my own son out of my life. I am just refusing to hand him the knife he wants to use to cut his own throat." The Spendthrift Trust is not a punishment, Darcy. It is a life jacket. Vernon threw a life jacket to a drowning man. But the drowning man still has to choose to put it on. I looked at the green folder. I looked at the brown leather journal resting in my lap. I wrapped my fingers around the worn cover and held it tight against my stomach. What do I have to do right now? Right now, you do absolutely nothing, Pruitt instructed. We let your father's behavior accumulate. Every single day he lives in that mansion acting like the owner. Every contract he signs, every renovation Bonnie attempts to start, is another piece of evidence triggering the forfeiture clause. In the meantime, we need to trace exactly where that missing $320,000 went. I know a forensic accountant in Grand Rapids. His name is Lyle Novak. We need to engage his services immediately. I nodded once, my jaw setting tight. I crossed the threshold in that moment. I was no longer the quiet social worker making herself small in the hallway. There is one more person you need to see, Pruitt added, as I stood up to leave. Marta Solis. She was the second witness to the trust signing. Go see her. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, I was knocking on a peeling green door in the Westwood neighborhood. The apartment building was old, with narrow stairwells that smelled faintly of pine cleaner and fried onions. The door opened, and Marta stood there wearing a faded yellow apron over her practical clothes. She did not say a single word. She just reached out, pulled me across the threshold, and wrapped her arms around my shoulders. I did not cry out loud, but my chest hitched, and my shoulders shook against her frame. She held me tightly for a long time. The smell of her apron, a mixture of laundry soap and the peppermint candies she always kept in her pockets, grounded me. She led me into her small kitchen and pressed me into a wooden chair. She set a steaming mug of chamomile tea in front of me. The ceramic mug was painted with bright yellow sunflowers. I wrapped both hands around the warm clay, letting the heat seep into my cold palms. I looked at her hands as she sat down across from me. They were small and heavily calloused from 40 years of lifting patients, washing floors, and doing the hard, invisible labor that keeps broken bodies functioning. These were the exact same hands that had lifted my grandfather from his wheelchair, the hands that had smoothed his blankets when his breathing grew ragged at the very end. I realized then that I was not the only person who had lost him. Her grief was just as real and just as heavy. "He talked about you every single day," Marta said softly. Her voice was steady, but her dark eyes were shining. "Every day, Darcy." He would sit at the kitchen island and say, "Darcy fixed the leaking pipe under the sink yesterday." Or he would eat his dinner and whisper to me, "Darcy made the chili way too salty tonight, but I am not going to tell her that." He always smiled when he talked about you. His whole face changed. She paused, running a thumb over the rim of her own mug. He never smiled when he talked about Randall. I took a slow sip of the chamomile tea. The warm liquid helped loosen the tight knot in my throat. "Malcolm Pruitt told me you were there when he signed the papers." Marta nodded firmly. I was. He wore a blue button-down shirt, the only one he actually let me iron for him. He sat right at the big dining room table. Mr. Pruitt sat on his right, and I sat on his left. Your grandfather read every single page out loud before he picked up his pen. His hands were completely steady. His eyes were clear as a bell. When he finished signing the last page, he shook our hands, looked right at me, and said, "Now she is safe." A sharp ache bloomed directly behind my ribs. He had spent his final months quietly building a fortress around me, and he never said a word about it. Marta leaned forward, resting her calloused hands flat on the small kitchen table. "There is something else you need to know. 8 months ago, I was wiping down the kitchen counters. He was sitting at the table, talking on the telephone. He always kept the speakerphone on because his hearing was getting bad. I heard your father's voice on the other end. I sat perfectly still, holding my breath. Your grandfather asked him a direct question," Marta continued. He said, "Randall, you took several large amounts of cash out of my accounts. What is the money for?" Your father answered him quickly. He sounded slick, like a salesman. He said he was just managing the portfolio to get better returns. Your grandfather stayed quiet for a long time. Then he just said, "All right," and hung up the phone. Marta looked down at the table, shaking her head slowly. He sat there in the silence for 5 whole minutes. Then he looked over at me and said, "When people lie to you, Marta, their voice always goes up a little bit. At the very end of the sentence, they sound like they are asking themselves if their own lie is actually good enough to work." The accuracy of the observation struck me hard. My grandfather had not been confused. He had not been slipping away. He had been sitting in his kitchen, listening to his only son steal from him. And he had analyzed the betrayal with the cold, mechanical precision of an engineer diagnosing a failing engine. Marta reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was rough and incredibly warm. "The last week he was alive," she whispered, her voice finally trembling. "He gave me one final instruction. He said, 'Marta, when I am gone, if my granddaughter calls you, I want you to tell her everything, but only if she calls you first. If she does not pick up the phone, then I was completely wrong about her, and that will be okay too.'" I stared into the dark surface of my tea. The mug rattled faintly against the saucer as my hands began to shake. It had been a test, The journal left on the nightstand, the cryptic message on the first page, the phone number waiting for me. He had built the fortress. But he needed to know if I had the spine to walk through the front door and claim it. If I had stayed quiet, if I had accepted my eviction and faded into the background like I had done my entire life, the trap would have rusted shut forever. I looked up at Marta. The fear that had been paralyzing me since yesterday morning was entirely gone. In its place was a quiet, solid core of steel. My grandfather had seen my worth when I could not see it myself. Now, it was my turn to prove him right. 4 days after the will reading, I drove the long stretch of highway up to Grand Rapids. The morning sky hung low and grey, threatening rain that never seemed to fall. Malcolm Pruitt had given me an address for a forensic accountant named Lyle Novak. I parked my car in a crowded asphalt lot and found his office on the second floor of a brick building that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner. Lyle Novak did not look like a man who spent his life inside spreadsheets. He spoke fast, his words spilling over each other, and his desk was a chaotic landscape of stacked folders and bright yellow adhesive notes. 3 glowing computer monitors formed a glowing wall on his desk. 2 separate ceramic mugs held cold coffee, and he occasionally picked up the wrong one, took a sip, and grimaced. I sat across from him and pulled out my checkbook. My hand hovered over the paper. Lyle required a $500 retainer to begin the preliminary search. The rest of his fee would come later if we found enough evidence to file a formal dispute. $500 was a fraction of what most lawyers charged. But for me, it was a massive anchor dropping into my bank account. I made $52,000 a year working for the county. My rent on the Main Street apartment took $850 a month. Between gas, groceries, and utilities, I had exactly $2,100 in my entire life savings. I was writing away nearly a quarter of my safety net. I was handing it over to a fast-talking stranger in a messy office, entirely because my dead grandfather left me a leather journal and a pocket watch. I pressed the pen to the paper and wrote the amount out in full. I signed my name at the bottom and slid the check across the desk. "Money is fundamentally lazy," Lyle said, picking up the check and slipping it into a drawer without looking at it. "It always takes the easiest path. If your father used a shell company to move funds, the routing numbers will tell us the entire story. People lie all the time, Darcy. Banks do not lie. They are the most honest institutions in the country, not because they have good morals, but because federal regulators make them keep perfect records." He turned his chair toward the center monitor and tapped his keyboard. A digital document filled the screen. "I did a little digging before you arrived," Lyle explained, pointing a pen at the glowing text. "Engel Properties Capital. It was registered in this state 2 years ago. The registered agent is Randall Engel. The address is a post office box. There is no physical office space. Darcy, this company has absolutely no revenue. They have no clients. They have no employees. It exists for one single purpose: to receive money from somewhere else and send it somewhere else. That is not a business. That is a pipe." I stared at the screen, watching my father's name sit next to a hollow corporate shell. "I need your grandfather's bank records to see what went through that pipe," Lyle said. He stopped typing and spun his chair back to face me. "Can you get me authorization to pull them?" "I am the trustee," I told him. Lyle stopped moving entirely. He blinked twice. "You are the trustee of a $15 million irrevocable trust." Apparently. A slow, sharp smile spread across his face. He leaned back in his chair. "Well then, you have absolute legal standing to request every single financial record related to those trust assets, including any prior transactions made before his death. Let me make a phone call." When our meeting ended, I stood up to put my coat on. As I turned toward the door, I noticed a framed photograph hanging on the wall next to the coat rack. It showed an older man sitting in a wheelchair, offering a quiet, dignified smile to the camera. The brass plaque at the bottom read Harold Novak, 1938 to 2019. Lyle noticed where I was looking. He walked over, reached out, and pressed his fingertips gently against the wooden frame. He held them there for exactly 1 second before letting his hand drop. "My father," Lyle said quietly. He did not offer any other details, and I did not ask. He did not need to explain. The way he touched the frame told me everything I needed to know about why he took these kinds of cases, and why he chased stolen money with such relentless energy. We both knew exactly what it felt like to watch someone you love lose their strength. Exactly 1 week after the will reading, I was sitting at the tiny kitchen table in my apartment when my phone vibrated against the wood. It was Marta. She still had her key to the Lakeshore mansion. My grandfather had given it to her 3 years ago, and Bonnie had been too distracted by her new wealth to remember to ask for it back. Marta had gone over to the house to collect a few personal items she left in the utility room. "They are already measuring the walls," Marta said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Bonnie hired an interior designer. They walked right through the kitchen while I was packing my bag. She pointed at Mr. Vernon's bedroom and said it was going to be a meditation room. "Your old bedroom is going to be a home gym. And they are talking about converting the garage workshop into a wine cellar." I gripped the edge of my table. The workshop, the place that smelled like machine oil and sawdust, where he taught me how to fix broken radios and build birdhouses. "A wine cellar. That is not all," Marta continued. The sound of a door clicking shut echoed over the phone, meaning she had stepped outside to speak freely. "Your father bought a brand new espresso machine. $3,400. I saw the receipt sitting on the counter. Bonnie took a picture of it and posted it on the internet. Her caption said, "New chapter, new home, new me." I closed my eyes. The image of the cardboard boxes sitting on my peeling vinyl floor flashed in my mind. "Oh." "And a thick envelope from the Department of Motor Vehicles arrived in the mail today," Marta added, her tone shifting into dry disbelief. "She ordered custom license plates for the electric car. The plates say ENGLQN. Engel Queen." I pressed the phone harder against my ear. "Are they staying in the house right now?" "Yes," Marta said softly. "But Darcy, his room is completely empty. They stripped the bed. They packed up his books. The only thing left in there is a lighter-colored rectangle on the wall where your grandmother's portrait used to hang." A cold, heavy block of ice settled deep in my chest. They were erasing him. They were moving through the rooms he built, stripping away every piece of evidence that he had ever existed, replacing his life with expensive coffee and custom car accessories. "Marta," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "they cannot sell that house. They cannot renovate those rooms. They cannot touch a single wall. They are acting like they own the world," she whispered. "I know," I replied, looking down at the brown leather journal resting on my table. "They just do not know yet." 10 days had passed since the morning Malcolm Pruitt read the will. I was at work, sitting in my county cubicle and reviewing a foster placement file, when my phone rang. The caller identification showed Lyle Novak. When I answered, his voice sounded completely different. The fast, energetic tempo from his office was entirely gone. He spoke slowly, deliberately. "Darcy, I need you to drive up to my office right now. There are some things you really need to see in person." I took my lunch hour, got in my car, and drove straight back to Grand Rapids. When I walked into his office, the chaos of adhesive notes had been pushed aside. A massive spreadsheet lay unrolled across the center of his desk. The paper was covered in bright red ink, circles, and thick highlighted blocks. All 3 computer monitors displayed dense rows of banking records. "Sit down," Lyle said. I took the chair opposite him. He turned the spreadsheet around so it faced me. "I tracked the pipeline," he began, tapping a red pen against the top row of numbers. "Over the course of 18 months, $320,000 was withdrawn from your grandfather's primary brokerage account. Your father used his durable financial power of attorney to authorize every single transfer. I stared at the staggering number. 320,000. Look at the amounts, Lyle instructed, dragging the tip of his pen down the column. 9,800, 9,500, 9,900. There are 47 separate transactions on this paper. Every single one of them is just under $10,000. I frowned, trying to make sense of the math. Why always under 10? It is a tactic called structuring, Lyle explained, his voice growing tight. When a person withdraws $10,000 or more in cash, the bank is legally required to file a currency transaction report with the federal government. Your father intentionally kept every transfer just below that limit to avoid triggering an alert. That is not an accounting error, Darcy. That is a deliberate strategy to evade detection. He pulled out a second sheet of paper and laid it next to the first. The money poured into Engel Properties Capital. That was the shell company we found. But it did not stay there. Within 48 hours of every deposit, the exact same amount was transferred into Randall's personal checking account at Chase Bank, and from there, the money went straight to paying contractors in Grand Rapids, covering massive interest payments and settling homeowner association fees for a failed condominium project. I looked at the dates. I looked at the routing numbers. My father had been drowning in debt from a failed real estate venture. Instead of asking for help, instead of admitting he had made a mistake, he had quietly siphoned away my grandfather's life savings to cover his own failures. The power of attorney document your grandfather signed gave Randall the authority to manage finances due to health reasons, Lyle said, leaning forward, resting his elbows heavily on the desk. But the law requires those funds to be managed strictly for the benefit of the principal. Using that money to pay off personal real estate debts is a direct violation of his fiduciary duty. Under state law, this is the financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Exploitation, I repeated. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. Darcy, because the amount exceeds $100,000, this is a felony-level offense. We are looking at potential prison time and fines up to 3 times the value of the stolen assets. Your father did not just take money. He structured the withdrawals to hide them. That is a plan. I sat perfectly still, staring at the 47 lines of data. 47 times my father had logged into an account. 47 times he had typed in a number just under the legal reporting limit. 47 times he had hit a button to steal from the man who raised him. This was not a moment of weakness. This was a sustained, calculated campaign. I used to think my father was simply absent. I used to think he was just too busy trying to build his business, too preoccupied with his new wife to remember he had a daughter or a father who needed him. But $320,000 does not happen accidentally. He had not forgotten about us. He had simply looked at us and decided we were a resource to be consumed. There is one more thing, Lyle said quietly. He flipped to the very last page of his report. It was a photocopy of a bank statement from the primary brokerage account. My breath caught in my throat. It was the exact same statement I had seen sitting on the kitchen table 2 years ago. The columns matched perfectly, and there, near the bottom of the page, were 3 thick lines of bright yellow highlighter, marking the 3 largest withdrawals from that month. Your grandfather highlighted these specific transactions, Lyle said, tracing the yellow marks with his finger. He requested physical copies from the bank, based on the timeline of the phone recording Malcolm Pruitt has. Your grandfather highlighted these lines weeks before he ever called your father to ask about the money. My heart hammered against my ribs. The kitchen table, the morning light pouring through the window, my grandfather sitting in his chair, sipping black coffee, deliberately leaving the paper open for me to see. He had not been asking a question when he called my father. He already possessed the answer. He already held the proof in his hands. He was simply offering his son one final chance to tell the truth. "Can we use this in court?" I asked, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "We can use this in probate court. We can hand it to Adult Protective Services, and we can deliver it straight to the district attorney." Lyle confirmed. "Darcy, your father did not just violate the terms of a trust. He committed a massive felony." I closed my eyes. The image of the yellow highlighter burned against the back of my eyelids. I did not want my father to go to prison. I just wanted my grandfather to be right. I wanted the leather journal and the pocket watch and the second page of the will to mean something. I wanted proof that he had not lost his mind at the end of his life. He had not lost his mind. He was a mechanical engineer. He had seen a catastrophic failure in the system, and he had spent his final days building an engine perfectly designed to correct it. All I had to do was turn the key. I sat at the small, pressed wood table in my kitchen. The veneer on the corner nearest the wall was peeling back, exposing the rough, dry composite underneath. Resting dead center on the uneven surface was a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper. The letterhead at the top read Pruitt and Associates in crisp black ink. I read the text for the third time. Malcolm Pruitt had drafted the document exactly as we discussed. It contained no emotional appeals. It offered no threats. It consisted of 4 completely sterile, devastating paragraphs of pure fact. The first paragraph stated that according to page 2 of the last will and testament of Vernon James Engel, all real property and financial assets belonged exclusively to the irrevocable trust. The second paragraph declared that I, Darcy May Engel, was the sole appointed trustee under the state trust code. The third paragraph outlined that my father was merely a beneficiary bound by a spendthrift restriction, entitled only to a monthly allowance of $4,000, with absolutely no authority to sell, mortgage, lease, or alter any property owned by the trust. The fourth paragraph was the trap snapping shut. It clearly stated that any listing agreement, renovation contract, or property alteration my father had signed in the past 12 days was legally void. The Lakeshore mansion belonged to the trust, and he was nothing more than a guest. At the bottom of the page, a blank line waited for my ink. My hand did not shake when I picked up the pen. For my entire life, whenever I signed my name on a document involving my family, it was to agree, to comply, or to step out of the way. I pressed the ballpoint into the heavy paper and signed my name, Darcy May Engel, trustee. For the very first time, I was not asking for permission. I was making a declaration. Pruitt handled the delivery. He sent 1 copy via certified mail and dispatched a private process server to hand a second copy directly to my father. I did not go to the mansion. I stayed in my apartment, sitting on the peeling vinyl floor of my kitchen because I did not own a second chair. And I waited. 4 hours later, my cell phone vibrated against the floorboards. The screen flashed with my father's name. I did not pick it up. I watched the phone buzz, go dark, and immediately light up again. He called 14 times in the span of 45 minutes. When the screen finally stayed dark, a notification appeared showing a string of new voicemails. I pulled my knees up to my chest, pressed the phone to my ear, and listened to them in exact chronological order. The first message was marked by pure confusion. "Darcy," my father said, his voice sounding completely normal, just slightly rushed. "I just got handed some incredibly bizarre letter from Pruitt. Call me back as soon as you get this. We need to clear this up." By the third message, the confusion had burned away into raw anger. "What in the world is this?" he demanded, his voice echoing slightly, lightly pacing across the hardwood floors of the foyer. "Trustee? Spendthrift? Your grandfather left me that house. My name is on the will. Call me back right now." The seventh message was the one that made my breath catch. The anger was gone. In its place was a tight, high vibration I had never heard from him before. "Fear. Darcy, Please listen to me. We really need to talk about this. This whole thing is just a massive misunderstanding. Just pick up the phone, please. The final message, the 14th voicemail, did not come from my father. Bonnie had taken the phone. I do not know what kind of game you think you are playing, little girl, she hissed. Her normally sweet, breathless tone had completely shattered, turning shrill and jagged. But we have a very expensive lawyer, and we will contest this garbage. Do you really think you can just take this house from us? Your grandfather left this property to your father. This is a family matter, and you are just a grandchild. You have no idea what you are getting into. I lowered the phone. I tracked the entire trajectory of their morning through those audio files. Confusion, anger, fear, aggression. It was exactly the psychological pattern Malcolm Pruitt had predicted. Vernon had predicted it too. He knew exactly how his son would react when the walls finally closed in. I called Pruitt and gave him a full report on the voicemails. Good, the lawyer said. His voice was calm, anchoring me to the reality of the law. They are reacting exactly as expected. Now, listen to what Bonnie said. She used the word contest. That means they are going to hire their own representation. Any competent estate lawyer will look at an irrevocable trust with a spendthrift provision and tell them it is virtually impossible to break under Michigan law. But Bonnie is not the kind of person who listens to a lawyer. Bonnie is the kind of person who tells a lawyer what she wants to hear. What does that mean for us? I asked. It means she will push Randall to fight. Pruitt explained. They will hire a litigation attorney. That attorney will likely file a capacity challenge. They will try to argue that Vernon lacked the mental competence to execute the trust when he signed it. It is the only door left open to them. And your grandfather perfectly barricaded that door with the video deposition, so we just show them the video? Not yet, Pruitt said firmly. We do not show the video. We do not show the audio recording. We do not show the forensic accounting report. We let them file their petition first. Every single step they take right now is just another piece of evidence they are building against themselves. I hung up the phone and looked around my tiny living space. The apartment was completely silent. The cracked plate still sat in the sink, but the silence did not feel empty anymore. The silence felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. My phone vibrated one more time. It was a text message from Marta. Bonnie just chased the interior designer out the front door. She is screaming in the kitchen. Randall is sitting in his car inside the garage. The engine has been running for 20 minutes. He has not moved. I stared at the glowing text. 20 minutes sitting in a parked car. I knew exactly what that felt like. I had done the exact same thing 12 days ago, parked at the end of Lakeshore Drive, staring at a brown leather journal and wondering how my entire life had vanished in a single morning. My father was sitting in the exact same cold, hollow space I had occupied. A part of me, the social worker who spent her life putting broken people back together, felt a sudden, sharp ache of empathy for him, but I pushed it down. He had built his own cage. 2 hours later, Marta called me. When I answered, I heard something I had not heard since the day of the funeral. She was laughing. It was a quiet, breathless sound, but it was real. Darcy, Marta said, catching her breath. The envelope from the Department of Motor Vehicles arrived in the mail. I sat up straight against the kitchen wall. The custom plates? Yes, Marta said, her voice bright with amusement. They are sitting right on the kitchen island. ENGLQN. Queen. The metal plates are resting right next to the certified letter Malcolm Pruitt sent. Bonnie has not even opened the envelope. She is locked in the master bedroom upstairs. Crying, she actually ordered vanity plates for the electric car, I said. A slow smile finally breaking across my face. The car that belongs exclusively to the trust. The car she cannot legally drive out of the driveway without the express written permission of the trustee. How much do those custom plates cost? Marta asked. $50 for the registration, plus the personalization fee, I replied, Doing the quick math in my head, probably about $100 total. Well, Marta said dryly, that might be the most expensive $100 that woman has ever spent in her entire life, buying custom metal plates she can never use for an electric car she does not own. Parked inside a garage that does not belong to her, we both fell silent for a second. And then I laughed. It bubbled up from my chest, clear and loud, bouncing off the thin walls of my apartment. Marta laughed right along with me. It was not a cruel sound. We were not laughing at their pain. We were laughing at the pure, brilliant irony of a woman who cared so much about her royal image that she accidentally documented her own delusion in that small moment. Listening to Marta laugh through the speaker of my phone, I realized we had become a family. The blood ties connecting me to the man sitting in his running car felt incredibly thin. But the bond I shared with the woman who had held my grandfather's hand felt like solid rock. The battle was coming, but for the first time in my life, I was actually ready to fight. 16 days after I sat in Malcolm Pruitt's office and listened to him read the will, my phone rang. The screen displayed the lawyer's name. When I answered, the steady, measured rhythm I had come to expect from him was entirely gone. Bonnie hired Victor Lasky, Pruitt said. He did not bother with a greeting. I stood by the small window in my apartment, watching the traffic roll down Main Street. Who is Victor Lasky? He is a litigation attorney based out of Grand Rapids, Pruitt explained, his voice tight. He specializes in massive estate disputes. We have been opposing counsel on 2 different cases over the years. He does not play fair, Darcy. He plays to win, and he plays ugly. He just filed a petition to invalidate the trust at the county probate court. My grip tightened on the phone. The plastic edge pressed sharply into my palm. On what grounds? Lack of testamentary capacity, Pruitt replied. He is arguing that your grandfather was 89 years old and suffering from a documented history of cognitive episodes. Lasky is building a narrative that Vernon lacked the mental competence to execute an irrevocable document. I closed my eyes. The sheer audacity of the claim made my chest ache. My grandfather did the Sunday crossword puzzle in pen. He calculated his own tax liabilities by hand before handing the paperwork to his accountant. Pruitt, that is insane. It is highly creative, the lawyer corrected me. I will give them that. They are actually arguing that the spendthrift provision itself is evidence of incapacity. They are claiming that a rational, healthy man would naturally trust his own son with the family money. Therefore, placing restrictions on Randall proves your grandfather was suffering from paranoid ideation and impaired judgment. They are using the trap he built to prove he was crazy. Exactly, Pruitt said. Lasky does not even need to win this argument outright. He just needs to create enough doubt in the mind of a judge to force an order for mediation. In mediation, Bonnie will push for a settlement. She will demand a 50-50 split of the assets, or maybe 60-40 in her favor, just to make the lawsuit go away. But we have the video deposition, I reminded him. We have him on camera. We do, Pruitt agreed. But Lasky filed his petition first. Now we have to respond. That is the game we are playing now. He paused, and the line went quiet for a moment. There is a medical declaration attached to their filing. Bonnie found a doctor. I need you in my office on Thursday, 18 days after the will reading. I sat across from Pruitt and stared at a 6-page legal document. The room smelled strongly of warm printer toner and old paper. The pages in front of me contained a sworn affidavit from Dr. Gavin Holt, a geriatric specialist practicing in Grand Rapids. I read the formal, devastating paragraphs. Dr. Holt stated that based on his review of available medical records and reports provided by family members, my grandfather exhibited cognitive patterns consistent with early-stage vascular dementia. In the 18 months preceding the creation of the trust, this doctor never treated him, I said, keeping my voice as level as possible. He never even met my grandfather. He reviewed the selective records Bonnie provided, Pruitt said, leaning back in his chair. That is how Lasky works. You find a doctor, you give them half the medical picture, and you secure an affidavit. It is incredibly lazy, but lazy works in their favor because now the burden shifts to us, to disprove a medical professional. I pointed at the second page of the document. He cites 2 emergency room visits from last year. One was a fall in the bathroom. The other was a dizzy spell at the grocery store. I drove him to the hospital both times. The doctors said it was a mild reaction to his new blood pressure medication. It had absolutely nothing to do with his memory. I know, Pruitt said gently. And we will demonstrate that. But Darcy, this is exactly the scenario Vernon warned me about. For the second time since this began, the lawyer used my grandfather's first name. Vernon sat in that chair and told me Randall would never fight him directly. He said his son would find someone else to declare him crazy because that was much easier than admitting his father was right. That is precisely why we recorded the video deposition. Pruitt slid another packet of paper across the desk. Read the sworn statement Bonnie attached to the petition. I picked up the heavy pages. Bonnie had documented 3 specific episodes where she claimed my grandfather failed to recognize his own son. I read the descriptions carefully. She provided exact dates and specific times. She claimed that during Thanksgiving last year, Vernon asked the same question 4 times in a single hour. She claimed he tried to drive to a hardware store that had closed 5 years ago. The details were incredibly specific. They were far too specific for a woman who visited the Lakeshore house maybe 3 times a year. She had spent more time crafting this fictional narrative than she had ever spent sitting in the same room with the man. I reached the bottom of the second page. My eyes stopped moving. I read the paragraph again. Then I read it a third time. Bonnie described an incident where she supposedly found my grandfather wandering confused in his own bedroom. To add authenticity to her story, she described the room in vivid detail. She wrote about the heavy oak dresser, the brass lamps, and the pale blue wallpaper with white trim. My breath caught. I stared at the words pale blue wallpaper. 2 years ago, during the first week of spring, Marta and I spent 3 days stripping that pale blue paper off the walls. We sanded the drywall and painted the entire room a warm beige. My grandfather had chosen the specific color himself. He kept the small cardboard paint swatch from the hardware store sitting on his nightstand for 2 full weeks before finally deciding on a shade called Arizona Tan. Bonnie was describing a room she had not set foot inside for over 2 years. She had built her entire sworn statement on a lie, and she had just handed us the hammer to shatter it. I picked up a pen from Pruitt's desk, pulled a yellow sticky note from a pad, and wrote a single sentence. The wallpaper was changed 2 years ago. I slid the note across the polished wood. Pruitt picked up the small yellow square. He read my handwriting. He did not smile. But he reached into his top drawer, pulled out a paperclip, and fastened the note directly to Bonnie's sworn statement. Good, he said quietly. 2 days later, the small victory of the wallpaper evaporated completely. 20 days after the will reading, I sat on the peeling vinyl floor of my apartment. It was 10 o'clock at night. The only light in the room came from my cell phone, resting on the floor beside me. The screen displayed a forwarded email from Pruitt. Victor Lasky had just filed an aggressive motion for an emergency hearing. Judge Alvin Meade had granted the request. We were scheduled to appear in probate court in exactly 5 days. 5 days. We had less than a week to prepare a defense against a lawyer who charged $600 an hour, armed with a doctor's affidavit and a perfectly crafted lie. I leaned my back against the thin drywall. My legs were stretched out straight in front of me. The brown leather journal rested heavily on my thighs. The elastic band was still holding the cover shut. I had not opened it since the morning I read the first page. I picked up my phone and dialed Pruitt's private cell number. He answered on the first ring. He always answered. Can we actually win this? I asked. My voice sounded thin and hollow in the empty apartment. Pruitt was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, he did not offer false comfort. "We have incredibly strong evidence, Darcy. We have the video, the audio recording, the testimony Marta is prepared to give, and the forensic financial report from Lyle Novak. But Lasky is a master at making clean things look dirty. Judge Meade is a deeply conservative magistrate. He is cautious. If Lasky creates even a fraction of a doubt regarding your grandfather's mental state, Meade will likely order an independent medical evaluation. And what happens if he does that? If an evaluation is ordered, the process stalls," Pruitt explained. "It will take 60 to 90 days to complete. During that entire period, Randall and Bonnie will remain in the mansion. Bonnie will begin stripping the assets. She will sell the antiques. She will damage the property. Lasky does not need to win the hearing. He just needs time. Time. And time cost money." I looked around my 550-square-foot box. My savings account was currently sitting at exactly $1,600. The retainer for the forensic accountant had taken a massive bite out of my safety net. Pruitt was handling the bulk of my legal representation out of loyalty to my grandfather. But the court filing fees, the document processing, and the basic administrative costs had already forced me to put over $2,000 on a credit card I normally kept empty. If Lasky succeeded in stalling this case for 3 months, I would have to choose between fighting for the trust and paying my own rent. Lasky knew exactly what he was doing. He knew the daughter of a county social worker did not have the financial endurance to survive a protracted legal war against a $15 million estate. That is their entire plan, I whispered into the phone. "Stall the court and bankrupt me. That is the standard playbook," Pruitt confirmed softly. "And it costs you significantly more than it costs them, because they are sitting inside the house, and you are not." I thanked him and ended the call. The silence of the apartment rushed back in. The cheap refrigerator in the corner kicked on with a loud, vibrating hum. I had never noticed how loud the appliance was when I actually lived here. At the Lakeshore Mansion, the only sound you ever heard late at night was the heavy grandfather clock in the study. Tick, tick, tick. My grandfather used to sit in his leather chair and listen to it. He told me the sound of the clock let him know the house was still breathing. The house was still there, but the wrong people were listening to it breathe. I looked down at the leather journal, resting on my legs. I slid my thumb under the elastic band. My grandfather had left pages of notes, columns of numbers, and dates. I had not read the final page. I was terrified of what it might say. I was even more terrified that it might say absolutely nothing at all, leaving me completely alone in this fight. At 10:30, the doorbell rang. The sharp buzz made me jump. I set the journal on the floor, pushed myself up, and walked to the door. I looked through the small glass peephole and quickly turned the deadbolt. Marta stood in the dim hallway. She was holding a brown paper grocery bag. "I do not know anything about the law," she said, stepping past me into the apartment before I could even say a word. "I do not know anything about trusts, or courts, or litigation attorneys, but I know Mr. Vernon was never crazy for a single second of his life. And I know you should not be sitting by yourself on the floor of a dark apartment at 10:30 at night, without anything to eat." She walked into the tiny kitchen area and set the bag on the counter. She pulled out 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil, a large silver thermos of chamomile tea, and a cloth napkin embroidered with small white daisies. She walked back into the living space and sat down directly on the peeling vinyl floor, right next to where I had been sitting. She patted the floor beside her. I sank down against the wall. She unwrapped a sandwich and handed it to me. I took a bite of the cold bread. The taste of roasted turkey and sharp cheddar hit my tongue, and suddenly, the dam completely broke. I did not sob out loud. I did not scream, but the tears started falling, fast and heavy, dropping onto my hands and soaking into the foil wrapper. It was the physical release of 20 days of pure, compressed terror. 20 days of holding my breath, pretending I was strong enough to fight my own family, pretending I was not terrified of losing everything. Marta did not try to hug me. She did not pat my shoulder or tell me everything was going to be fine. She simply sat beside me on the hard floor, eating her sandwich, letting me fall apart in the quiet dark. We sat there together for a very long time. Two women sharing a meal on a broken floor, fighting a ghost war against people who had everything. When the thermos was finally empty, Marta gathered the foil wrappers and stood up. She smoothed the front of her dark coat and looked down at me. "Darcy," she said gently. The morning he signed those trust papers, he looked at me and said, "Marta, this is the very last thing I did right." He did not say it was the only thing. He said it was the last thing. That means he knew he made a lot of terrible mistakes with his son over the years. But he was absolutely certain about you. She walked to the door, let herself out, and pulled it shut behind her. I sat on the floor and pulled the leather journal back onto my lap. The fear of opening it was completely gone. I rested my hand flat against the worn brown cover. Tomorrow morning, when the sun came up, I was going to read the final page. The morning sun pushed through the narrow window of my studio apartment, casting a thin, slanted rectangle of light across the vinyl floor. I sat on the edge of the boards, the leather journal resting on my knees. A cup of coffee sat cooling on the windowsill because my kitchen table was too small to hold both a meal and a book. I stared at the worn brown cover for a long time before I finally found the courage to flip to the very last page. The handwriting on this final sheet was different from the precise, upright block letters in the rest of the journal. The ink was slightly shaky, the lines slanting as if the hand holding the pen had started to tire. It was dated exactly 2 days before my grandfather died. "Darcy, if you are reading this page, it means I was right about Randall. I wished I was wrong. You must believe me when I say that this trust is not a punishment for my son. It is the very last thing I could do to keep him from destroying himself completely. I love Randall, but I see Randall. When you love someone but see them clearly for exactly who they are, that is the only kind of love that actually matters. Do not be angry at me for not cutting him off. And do not be angry at Randall for being Randall. Anger will only make you more like your father." I stopped reading, my vision blurring. I took a slow breath and continued down the page. "As for you, Darcy, you were here. You were here for 12 years. You were here every Saturday morning and every 3 a.m. phone call. You were here for every bowl of chili that was way too salty. And I never said a word because you were the only one who bothered to cook it. I did not leave the mansion to you because you deserve to be rich. I left it to you because you are the only person I trust not to break it. But you must understand that you have value whether I left you a house or not. You have value because you stayed when no one else would. This mansion is not a reward. It is me telling you that I saw you, Darcy. I always saw you. Love you. General out." I set the journal down on the floor. I whispered that nickname, General Out, into the empty room. It was a silly name I had given him when I was 15 because of the way he used to bark orders in the kitchen. He had kept that name for 23 years, and he had used it to say goodbye to me. Everything shifted in that moment. For weeks, I had been fighting because I wanted to win, because I wanted to keep the house, and because I wanted to punish the man who had thrown me away. But looking at those shaky blue lines, I realized I did not need the mansion to prove I mattered. My grandfather had already given me that proof. He had seen me. The trust was just a symbol, a final piece of engineering designed to protect the people he loved from their own worst instincts. I reached for my phone and called Malcolm Pruitt. "Play the recording," I said as soon as he answered. "Are you sure?" Pruitt asked. "I am sure," I told him. "I need to hear the truth. I need to hear all of it before we go to court." I drove to his office that afternoon. The blinds were drawn tight, and the room was quiet except for the low hum of his computer fan. Pruitt sat behind his desk and opened a digital audio file on his laptop. He reminded me that Michigan is a one-party consent state, and that since my grandfather was a participant in the call, the recording was entirely legal and admissible in court. Then he hit play. The quality was remarkably clear. I could hear the faint, rhythmic click of the ceiling fan at the mansion in the background. My grandfather's voice filled the office, sounding slow and deliberate. "Randall," he said, "the primary brokerage account has several large withdrawals. March, 9,800. April, 9,500. May, 9,900. Every single one is just under the reporting limit. What are you doing with that cash?" My father's voice came through the speakers next. He sounded casual, almost dismissive. "It is just portfolio management, Dad. I am just moving some things around to get us better returns. You know how it is. Portfolio management does not require cash withdrawals," my grandfather replied. "Portfolio management is done between the funds. Why did you take the cash?" There was a long silence on the recording. I counted 3 full seconds before my father spoke again. "Some of the smaller funds require initial deposits in cash," he said. "It is technical, Dad. I can explain it all later, Randall," my grandfather said, his voice dropping an octave. "I am recording this phone call. I am hoping you will tell me the truth. I am giving you the chance right now. Where did that money go?" The silence that followed lasted 12 seconds. I watched the timer on the laptop screen tick upward. When my father finally spoke, his voice was tight and defensive. "Dad, that is not necessary. The recording, I mean. Come on, I am your son. That is exactly why I am asking," my grandfather said. "And that is exactly why I am recording. Because I know that if I do not, tomorrow you will tell me this conversation never happened." "I have to go, Dad," my father snapped. "I have a showing." The line went dead with a sharp click. Pruitt closed the laptop. The ceiling fan in the recording stopped, leaving us in a heavy, ringing silence. My grandfather had known. He had held the evidence in his hand and offered his son a way out. And my father had chosen to walk deeper into the lie. "When do we play this?" I asked. "At the hearing," Pruitt said, "after their lawyer presents his case, after their doctor testifies and Bonnie reads her statement. We let them build their entire house of lies first. Then we show the court exactly what it is built on." He looked at me over his glasses. "Vernon designed this like an engineer, Darcy. Every piece fits together. Every bolt is tightened. The only question left is whether you are ready to turn the wrench." "I am ready," I said, "but I want my father to know something. After the judge makes a ruling, I want him to know that Grandpa gave him a chance on that recording. I want him to know it was not a trap. It was a test, and he is the one who failed it." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Marta came to the office to practice her testimony. She was calm and clear, explaining how my grandfather had done his crossword puzzles every morning and corrected her when she put his pills in the wrong slots. Lyle Novak finalized his 38-page forensic report, detailing every structured withdrawal and every transfer into my father's shell company. Pruitt played the video deposition for me one last time. My grandfather looked so alive on the screen, his eyes bright and sharp. He joked with Pruitt about looking old in the camera, and then he sat tall and explained exactly why he was creating the trust. He was sharp as a tack, his mind working with the same mechanical precision it always had. The night before the hearing, I lay in my bed with the journal resting on my chest. I picked up the pocket watch from the nightstand. I turned the small knob, winding it carefully, feeling the gears click into place, just as he had done every morning of his life. I did not know why I kept doing it, but sitting there in the dark, it felt like the only thing in the world that still made sense. I was ready. The House of Lies was standing, but I was holding the wrench. The Kalamazoo County Probate Court did not look like the courtrooms I had seen on television. There were no soaring marble columns or dramatic wood paneling. Instead, the room was small and cramped, with a low ceiling and flickering fluorescent lights that hummed with a persistent, nervous energy. The air smelled of industrial floor wax and the bitter, burnt scent of the coffee machine in the hallway. I sat at the table on the right side of the room, my hands pressed flat against the cool wood to keep them from shaking. Malcolm Pruitt sat beside me, his presence as steady and immovable as a mountain. Marta Solis sat in the first row of the gallery directly behind us, her back perfectly straight and her hands folded over her knees. Across the aisle, my father and Bonnie sat with Victor Lasky. Bonnie was dressed in a sharp black suit that I suspected was intended to look like mourning attire. But the crisp lines and expensive fabric felt more like a uniform for a takeover. Randall wore his best suit, though I noticed the sleeves were a fraction too short, revealing the heavy silver watch that caught the overhead light. Lasky sat between them, a thin man with slicked hair and a mountain of folders. Bonnie leaned over and whispered something in my father's ear. Then she looked directly at me and offered a tight, victorious smile. Judge Alvin Meade entered from a side door. He was a man in his 60s with thin wire glasses perched on his nose and a patient, neutral expression that gave nothing away. He looked through his notes for a moment, then looked up at the room. "This is the matter of the petition to invalidate trust. Case number 47129, the judge announced. His voice was a dry, practiced routine. "We are here to hear arguments regarding the testamentary capacity of Vernon James Engel." Victor Lasky stood up first. He spoke with a smooth, professional confidence that filled the small room. He laid out a narrative that turned my grandfather into a fragile, confused old man who had been manipulated into signing away his son's birthright. He spoke about the emergency room visits and the dizzy spells. He argued that the spendthrift provision itself was evidence of a mind consumed by paranoid ideation. "A rational father trusts his only son," Lasky claimed, his voice rising just enough to sound authoritative. "To place such restrictive, punitive measures on his sole heir is not the act of a sound mind. It is the act of a man losing his grip on reality." He then played a recorded deposition from Dr. Gavin Holt. The doctor's face appeared on a small monitor, his voice clinical and cold as he explained that, based on his review of the records, my grandfather had been suffering from early-stage dementia. He used long, complicated medical words to describe a man he had never actually met. When the video ended, Lasky read Bonnie's sworn statement. He detailed the 3 specific episodes where she claimed my grandfather failed to recognize Randall. He described the confusion and the repetitive questions. He read her description of my grandfather's bedroom, specifically mentioning the pale blue wallpaper with white trim as a way to ground her story in physical detail. I watched the judge. He was taking notes, his face a mask of professional indifference. I felt a sudden, sharp surge of fear. Lasky was good. He was making my grandfather's careful engineering look like the erratic behavior of a broken man. I looked at Pruitt. He remained perfectly still. He did not object. He did not react. He simply waited for Lasky to finish building his house of cards. "Respondent may call their first witness," Judge Meade said. Malcolm Pruitt stood up slowly. He buttoned his coat and walked toward the center of the floor. "Your Honor, we ask for the court's patience. We have 4 pieces of evidence that will resolve this matter conclusively." He called Marta Solis to the stand first. She walked to the front of the room, her small frame looking tiny against the judge's bench, but her voice was as clear as a bell. She described the 3 years she spent caring for my grandfather. She talked about the crossword puzzles he did in pen and the way he managed his own investment spreadsheets every Tuesday morning. "Miss Solis," Pruitt said, standing near the witness box, "the petitioner's statement describes the wallpaper in Mr. Engel's bedroom as pale blue. Is that accurate?" "No," Marta replied firmly. that wallpaper was removed in the spring of 2022. Darcy and I stripped it off and repainted the room a warm beige called Arizona Tan. Mr. Vernon chose the color himself and kept the swatch on his nightstand for 2 weeks before he let us start. Bonnie's mouth opened slightly. She looked at Lasky, but the lawyer was already writing something fast on a legal pad. The detailed lie she had crafted about a room she hadn't stepped inside for 2 years had just crumbled over a single paint color. Pruitt was not finished with Bonnie. He held up a second document and turned toward the judge. It was the sign-in sheet from his own office, dated 18 months earlier, bearing Bonnie's signature and a timestamp showing she had been present in his conference room for exactly 10 minutes during the trust planning meeting. She had been in the room when the trust was discussed. She had heard the conversation begin. She had chosen to walk out. Pruitt then moved to the second piece of evidence. He played the recording of the phone call between my grandfather and my father. The sound of the ceiling fan in the background filled the courtroom. We heard my grandfather ask about the $320,000. We heard my father lie about portfolio management. And then we heard the chilling moment where my grandfather told his son he was recording the call and begged him to tell the truth. Randall closed his eyes as the recording played. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized the ground was no longer beneath his feet. Next, Pruitt presented the forensic report from Lyle Novak. He walked the judge through the 47 separate transactions, each one structured just under $10,000 to avoid federal alerts. He explained how the money had been funneled through a shell company to pay off my father's personal debts. This is not a case of a confused old man being paranoid, Pruitt argued, his voice ringing with a sudden, sharp intensity. This is a case of a father who realized his son was exploiting him and took legal measures to protect the estate from further theft. Finally, Pruitt wheeled in the monitor and played the video deposition. My grandfather's face filled the screen. He looked healthy and sharp, his eyes bright with a familiar, engineering intelligence. He explained the trust. He explained the spendthrift clause, and then he looked directly into the camera, looking straight at where my father was sitting in the courtroom. "Randall, I love you," my grandfather said from the screen, "but I do not trust you with money. And I do not trust you with people. This trust is the last thing I can do for you." And for Darcy, who stayed. The room went completely silent when the video ended. Judge Meade removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at the documents on his desk for a long time. "Court will take a 15-minute recess," the judge announced. We stood in the hallway. I felt like I was floating, the adrenaline finally starting to recede and leaving a cold, heavy exhaustion in its place. Marta stood beside me, holding my hand. Randall and Bonnie remained inside the courtroom. Lasky was talking to them in a low, furious whisper. But my father wasn't listening. He was staring at the blank screen where his father's face had just been. When we returned, Judge Meade did not waste any time. He read from a handwritten sheet of paper. "The court finds that the video deposition demonstrates clear cognition and articulate reasoning," Meade began, "combined with the testimony of Miss Solis. There is no credible evidence of testamentary incapacity. The petitioner's statement regarding the bedroom decor was factually incorrect, which raises significant questions about the reliability of the other claims." He looked at my father and Bonnie. "The Vernon James Engel Irrevocable Trust is valid and enforceable. The petition to invalidate is denied." The judge paused, his eyes turning cold. "Furthermore, the court is troubled by the evidence of structured withdrawals and potential financial exploitation. I am referring this matter to the county prosecutor and Adult Protective Services for an independent investigation." He tapped his gavel once. The sound was small, but it felt like a door slamming shut. While the courtroom began to stir, Pruitt placed a single document on our table. It was a formal trustee resolution he had drafted 2 days earlier, invoking the moral forfeiture clause. The eviction, within 24 hours of the will reading, constituted familial cruelty under the trust terms. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the line. Effective immediately. Randall's monthly allowance was reduced to 0 for a 12-month probationary period. Pruitt slid the signed resolution into his folder without a word. Bonnie stood up and grabbed my father's arm, her face a mask of shrill, panicked fury. She started whispering about an appeal, but Randall pulled his arm away. He didn't look at her. He sat on the wooden bench as the courtroom emptied, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. I walked toward the door. But then I stopped. I looked at Pruitt, who gave me a small, encouraging nod, and then I walked back toward the bench where my father sat. "Did you know?" he asked. He didn't look up. "When he was alive, did you know he did this?" "No," I said. "He only told me to trust him." I didn't understand what it meant until I read the journal. Randall laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "He told me the same thing. I thought he meant he trusted me. I didn't realize he meant I was supposed to trust his design." He finally looked up at me. His eyes were red, but he wasn't crying. He just looked hollow. "He gave me a chance on that phone call, didn't he?" He was waiting for me to say it. "He was," I told him. "And you chose the lie." I looked at the man who had thrown me out of my home with 24 hours' notice. I should have felt a rush of victory. I should have felt the satisfaction of seeing him lose the mansion and the money. But all I felt was a quiet, heavy peace. My grandfather had seen me. That was the only recognition that mattered. "The trust has a provision," I said, my voice steady. "If the trustee deems it appropriate, the allowance can be reinstated after a probationary period. I am the trustee. Randall, the door is not locked, but you are the one who has to decide if you are going to be honest enough to walk through it." I turned and walked out of the courtroom. 1 week later, I used my new key to open the front door of the mansion. Malcolm Pruitt had already seen to it that the locks were changed. The house felt different now. It was quiet and still, smelling of old oak and the faint, lingering scent of my grandfather's coffee. Bonnie had already moved her things out. The espresso machine was gone, and the kitchen island was bare. I walked up the stairs to my grandfather's room. It was empty, but the warm beige paint we had chosen together looked bright in the afternoon sun. I walked down to the garage and into the workshop. The smell of machine oil and sawdust was still there, embedded in the heavy wooden workbench. I sat on his old stool and pulled the Waltham pocket watch from my pocket. I pressed the small button on the side, and for the first time, I looked at the back of the case. I noticed a tiny, shallow seam. I used a small screwdriver from the bench to gently pry the back cover open. Inside, in tiny, precise letters that he must have engraved himself, were 4 words. "Time is yours now." He hadn't left me a house to make me rich. He had left me the mansion and the trust to give me back the years I had spent making myself small for a family that didn't see me. He had given me my freedom. I wound the watch, feeling the familiar, rhythmic click of the gears. I stood up, walked back into the main house, and looked at the grandfather clock in the foyer. It was still ticking. Tick, tick, tick. I checked my watch. The time was exactly 4 o'clock. I walked to the kitchen, put on a pot of coffee, and sat down at the table. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone else to tell me what to do. The house was breathing, and finally, I was breathing with it.